All right. I'm taking this live on YouTube.
My question is, and do you know on which slide you are because of how the screen is right now?
Yes.
Is that this you comfortable with the
as
screen?
long as so it's not moving.
So why how are the slides are moving?
Just 1 second.
Mm.
Let me just click on it. Yeah.
Okay, that's how they move.
Oh, wait. You still see the, hold on 1 second. Over here. Boop. So it should. Oh, sorry. It's going off then.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Okay. There you go.
Now it works?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
have to click over there.
So, but I can use the arrow buttons.
Yeah,
I can. I'll be
Fine.
mindful not to
Yes.
propel my body that way. But the arrow, I can use the arrows, right? Sorry. Yeah, great.
And Justin, you checked the sound, right? You can hear us well. You can
Everything's good. I can hear
Yes.
you well. See
as
you.
a multi-recording again, and our students will come closer with their questions. And I will, from that same spot, share the questions from the Zoom attendees. So I'll monitor the Zoom chat and the YouTube chat as well, and ask folks to introduce themselves. So we're more on your end with like technical troubleshooting. And at times people might say, "Oh, we don't hear well," or there might be all sorts of comments from the Zoom attendees. So I will then. How should we communicate? Should I DM message you if anything is on the chat?
Yeah, you can DM me.
Okay, good. All right. I guess we can start letting people in on Zoom. Let's see if we. We'll wait a few minutes for our Zoom guests to join. You can also give us green light when to start.
You guys are free to start whenever you like. We have about 3 attendees in the Zoom room and
I guess
few
people,
in the YouTube as well.
yes. And I guess people will be joining later on and enter automatically, right?
Yeah, but you guys are all good to go whenever you're ready.
Wonderful. Okay, so welcome everyone in. We're starting our In Conversation last event of this spring 2024 semester. And we have an amazing guest here joining us today. And Marguerite Tartsinis will present us a lecture on Bohemianism in Bay Area and beyond. And we have a class led by Professor Herschel Steinbach joining here at the atrium at 625 Polk in San Francisco, the students from the trend forecasting class. And we're welcome also everyone who's watching us on YouTube or will watch in the recording. And it's over to Anne to share with us.
Yes, thank you so much, Elena. And thank you all for joining me today and all of you who are joining virtually. Sorry. To figure out where the camera is. I'm really excited to present this material and share it with you today. It comes from my experience writing about fashion as a curator at the Bard Graduate Center, where I worked on a number of fashion exhibitions from 2011 to about 2016, and research that I've done since then, both as a PhD at Stanford and afterward. Some of my research is centered on Bohemianism in the early 20th century in Greenwich Village, which is something we'll talk about later on in the presentation. But once I left New York, which is where Bard was located, and came here, I really started to think about what the kind of local strains of Bohemianism is. And it's really fascinating to me to think about it in terms of the late 19th century and early 20th century. So I'll share some of these thoughts. It's a bit of a survey, and I think hopefully we'll have a lively discussion after. So please save your questions for the end. And then we will chat about Bohemianism and what it is in fashion. All right, on March 1st, the Chloe Fall 2024 runway show spurred rumors of the return to the now often reviled aesthetic, boho chic. Immediately, the headlines followed. Quote, did Chloe just bring back boho chic? Vogue asked. Savoir Flair exclaimed, flou, ruffles, lace, the classic Chloe boho babe is back. And you see the presentation on the screen. The online magazine continued to define flou as not only the fluid, gauzy drape of couture garments that stands in stark contrast to the careful tailoring of couturiers and their atelier staff, but rather the emotional foundation to the brand, underscoring it as an ineffable characteristic that shapes its boho identity. Ahead of her debut, Vogue's Mark Holgate interviewed Kamina Kamali, the new artistic director of Chloe. He asked Kamali her thoughts on the possible return of boho chic. Quote, you know what I think that comes from? She said, I think there's this longing for undoneness and freedom and softness and movement. And when you look at history, it's rooted in the 1970s, when people wanted to free themselves from conventions and traditional lifestyles and sexuality. In terms of fashion, at some point, boho was overdone and overused. It was past its peak and had gotten really commercial. The industry got tired of it and it disappeared. But it's an interesting question because this longing for it comes from wanting to feel that spirit once more, end quote. Kamali's 70s flouncy hems, shirred necklines, snake necklaces, and wooden clogs harken back to an image of Chloe of then, of the 2000s, that not only helped define fashion, but also the look du jour. Everyone from the Olsens and Nicole Richie on the streets to Blake Lively as Serena Vanderwoodson and Gossip Girl, which some of you may have seen, and Misha Barton as Marissa Cooper on the OC, also from the early 2000s, adopted this very Chloe look. And these quotes come from a Vogue article and a Guardian article about the 2024 fall showing. But far from frivolous, for Kamali, boho chic spelled freedom for women. Gabby Agnon, who founded Chloe in the 1950s, injected lightness, and I'm quoting Kamali again here. She wanted women to be able to move and go to work, she said. And then in the late 70s, you had another moment of liberation in the evolution of femininity. I'd be remiss to mention boho chic without acknowledging its previous decline may have been caused by the proliferation of flower crowns, fringe, and lace at Coachella, since festival wear became a trend category unto itself in the early 2000s. Signifying the rampant forms of cultural appropriation endemic to the style, feather headdresses were common at the festival. During this period, it is important to note that companies like Urban Outfitters created designs that copied from Native American cultural symbolism, resulting in at least one instance of a lawsuit brought by the Navajo Nation after illegally using the tribe's name for a collection that included, quote, Navajo hipster panties and a Navajo print flask. And this was in 2012. However, the boho or bohemian aesthetic is much more culturally nuanced and far more historically resonant than its appropriation by those traveling on the summer concert circuit might realize. As Kamali noted, bohemian fashion is about liberation and freedom, two core tenets that have defined it since its origins in the late 19th century. Bohemianism and counterculture in the West includes I'm shifting to Bohemian counterculture in the West. And most studies of reformist and radical movements in the Bay Area index to the late 1940s and 1950s Beat generation. With its casually clad poets occupying bookstores and cafes in San Francisco's North Beach neighborhood, City Lights, of course, still in existence and being the most famous, or to the more widespread aesthetic and political convulsions of the 1960s counterculture. The sartorial codes of the civil rights movement, like Oakland-based Black Panthers on the left, and the Black Liberation, foundational to the Black is Beautiful movement in Harlem, New York at the same time, which is seen on the right with the Grandassa models in African dress. While the term Bohemianism often elicits passionate accounts of New Left politics and its affiliated protests, it also gestures to a far larger and more amorphous cultural field that by the 1970s became synonymous with New Age spiritual philosophies and consciousness-altering drug use and its associated psychedelia. Fluxus artist Jeff Berner described the zeitgeist in his, quote, astronauts of inner space, end quote, column for the San Francisco Chronicle. He said, there has never been a tribe of young people in history which took so much interest in life in its kaleidoscopic forms, Zuni culture, Oriental music, Zen, 19th century British socialism, jazz, electronic composition, magic, and religions from everywhere, end quote. The sartorial result was an efflorescence of independent designers working with a wide array of materials such as denim, cotton, leather, techniques such as embroidery, crochet, and tie-dye, influences such as textile art, international travel, religion, Native American culture, and new outlets to present their fashions such as boutiques, happenings, and concerts. And here I would direct you to the Summer of Love catalog from the Young, which really focused on this period of cultural efflorescence in the Bay Area. In fashion and dress, members of these subcultural groups diverted their gaze toward more purportedly youth-oriented designers, such as UK-based Thea Porter and Ossie Clark. Here's an example of some of the items actually that were in the Summer of Love show at the De Young, showing the kind of profusion of embroidery and fringe and kind of the pieced denim looks that were really popular at that time. And then here we have Ossie Clark and Thea Porter. More typically, they entirely rejected high-end fashion hailing from the esteemed design houses of New York and Europe. Instead, this cultural radicalism engendered anti-conformist aesthetic leanings that were catered to by a host of progressive Bay Area boutiques selling global imports and more utilitarian dress, like uniforms and military surplus, as chronicled by the all-too-short run of San Francisco-based magazine Rags, which ran from 1970 to 1971. And here in the center, you can see Bette Davis, who was a famous musician from the time, kind of modeling her miniskirt that she felt was considered a dirty miniskirt because it had a studded star right on the front in between her hips. Or perhaps the most radical sartorial gesture was to wear nothing at all, a mode where being, as it were, in the buff, expressed the most extreme reaction to the clothes standards of the day and social norms. And here we just have some images representing the human beings from 1967, where while those members are clothed, there certainly were very many where the clothes quickly came off. The second half of the decade saw the efflorescence of folk-inflected cross-cultural adaptations, characteristic of what was called funk and flash handmade fashion and more upmarket trends for artistic dress or artwear. This latter category quickly conjures the loose embroidered garb of San Francisco's Haight Street denizens or the glittering sartorial constructions of Chinatown native Kaisik Wong, whose Baroque one-of-a-kind creations were incorporated into his performances with the local drag troupe, the Coquettes, which are on the screen. The Coquettes entangled gay liberation with the presentation of politics through style and the joy of excess, especially excess decoration. Wong's couture garments, however, were sold in limited numbers at Sandra Sakata's preeminent local wearable art boutique, Obiko. Ranging from kaleidoscopic and oversized to elegant and ethereal, these handcrafted garments reflect an elaborate pastiche of cultural reference and telegraph the transcendental practices of 1970s counterculture, as well as his own queer, gender-fluid, utopian vision. Wong, who died in 1990, created otherworldly ensembles that serve as an apotheosis of the various and at times contradictory strains of bohemianism, and bohemian dress existing throughout the Bay Area since the beginning of the 20th century. And often these earlier manifestations of this bohemian impulse are less often considered. And as we kind of turn back to the late 19th century, I'll start with a quote from Frank Morris. "What is true of San Francisco is true of California. As yet we, out here on the fringe of the continent, with the ocean before and the desert behind us, are not a people, we are peoples, agglomerate rather than conglomerate." About the same time, Oscar Wilde, the famous bohemian dandy from Great Britain, visited San Francisco, and he wrote about San Francisco in his celebrated picture of Dorian Gray, where he said, "I suppose in about a fortnight we shall be told that he has been seen in San Francisco. It is an odd thing, but everyone who disappears is said to be seen at San Francisco. It must be a delightful city and possess all the attractions in the next world." And what these two quotes really bring together about San Francisco in the late 19th century is the fact that it is first and foremost on the edge of the continent, on the edge of the world. It's kind of out in the West, but it's also where numerous cultural groups come together, adventuring men and women come together and really kind of seek their fortunes because of the gold rush, but also because of the wildness and the kind of liberatory feeling of being out here on the edge. And given its location at the fringe of the continent, California and San Francisco particularly had its own boho flavor. That, for fashion and dress, was inseparable from its cultural politics. And here I'm going to offer a few definitions of Bohemianism. In 1850, writer Henry Muger described Bohemians as, quote, "water drinkers, artists too poor and too dedicated to their work to dissolve their problems with alcohol." George Sterling, famous San Francisco poet, said, "There are two elements, at least, that are central to Bohemianism. The first is devotion or addition to one or more of the 7 arts. The other is poverty." Other factors suggest themselves. For instance, I like to think of my Bohemians as young, as radical in the outlook on art and life, as unconventional, and though this is debatable, as dwellers in a city large enough to have the somewhat cruel atmosphere of all great cities. George Sterling interestingly died by taking cyanide only a couple of years, about a decade or so after writing this. Bohemia is the name. This is from Elizabeth Wilson, who wrote about Bohemian fashion and just Bohemian aesthetics and cultural politics in general. Bohemia is the name for the attempt by 19th and 20th century artists, writers, intellectuals, and radicals to create an alternative world within Western society, and indeed possibly elsewhere. Despite the exaggerated individualism of its citizens, Bohemia was a collective enterprise. The Bohemians created and participated in social milieu created against the dominant culture. As the artist made a startling transformation from a paid ideologue to violent critic of society in the unfamiliar world of modernity, so this is the late 19th, early 20th century, after the Industrial Revolution really changed the landscape of really the world. In France, for example, this was a revolt against the bourgeoisie. We're not really going to talk about France today, but it's certainly Bohemia really starts there much earlier than it does elsewhere. Thus, the cultural framework for Bohemianism, and by extension, Bohemian fashion, was so much more than just fringe and flou. Earlier manifestations of this Bohemian impulse are less often considered. As I mentioned, in the early 1900s, anti-bourgeois views flourished in the fin de siècle provincial salons and art colonies that flanked San Francisco's nascent cosmopolitan center. Owing to the destruction of the 1906 earthquake and fire, if they were able and had not already, many of the city's artists and literary figures relocated to the utopian communities of Carmel and Monterey, or fled across the San Francisco Bay to Berkeley or the Piedmont Hills. One example on the slide is the Bernard Maybeck-built Temple of the Wings, where Florence Boyton lived in a Greco-Roman goddess in flowing chiton-like dresses and robes. Alternatively, author and advocate for Native Americans, Mary Austin, who purportedly alternated between wearing Greek robes and indigenous hide-skin dresses. Mexican-born painter Xavier Timoteo Martinez, and King of Bohemia, poet George Sterling, who we just heard from, among others, roam freely throughout the region, forging a network of like-minded individuals that from time to time regrouped at Copa's, San Francisco's famed Montgomery Street hangout, or in Chinatown's assorted shops, stalls, and eateries. Here, as in other modern American enclaves, these progressive, albeit largely white, groups broke from the Puritan past by engaging in theatrical dress parties, literary bacchanalia, and close collaborations with avant-garde little theaters. And here we have an example. Arnold Gens took this picture of a kind of a pagan fete that was happening in Berkeley. This was published actually in a Midwestern newspaper I found in the archives. But what's captured here in these photographs is the way in which these dancers who were students at Berkeley were kind of taught dances based on Greco-Roman friezes from, for example, the Parthenon, right? Like the friezes that are on the actual buildings. And those poses kind of created a new style of dance that was a celebration of this pagan antiquity, but also this very bohemian lifestyle that was carefree and corsetless, as we'll see. So there was very little understructure underneath the garments kind of that would constrain the dancer. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Imbibing a potent mix of self-expression, radical philosophies, and aesthetic pursuits in service of a political and sexual revolt, members of these bohemian circles railed against society's conventional norms and often dressed to match. Bertha Boyd's 1911 California Votes for Women poster registers these entwined sartorial and political ideals. Framed by the setting sun at the Golden Gate, a woman is depicted in a suffragist yellow, shapeless floor-length dress and robe rather than the requisite shirtwaist and dark-skirted suit worn by protesters at marches and rallies throughout the country. This was until the right to vote was federally granted to women in 1920, so just over 100 years ago. While the fight for suffrage demanded the sober uniform of the suit, the representation of enfranchisement embraced an aesthetic paradigm rooted in the progressive ethos of earlier dress reform movements, in which proponents sought bodily autonomy free of social and physical demands of labor-oriented capitalism and traditional heteronormative family structures. The liberatory tenets of 19th century aesthetic dress in Europe and its precursor, rational dress in Britain, advocated for the abolition of restrictive clothing in service of an ideal, natural female body. And here I'll just provide a few examples of the 19th century movements, of which there are many more, which we certainly can talk about in the discussion, but I also encourage you to explore yourself. So if we're talking about freedom and liberation, we should talk about the bloomers. Some argue that the dress reform movement began earlier than the late 19th century in 1851 with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her neighbor Amelia Bloomer, who began wearing a radical new style of dress first designed by Stanton's cousin, Elizabeth Smith Miller. It soon became known as the Bloomer outfit and was worn by many prominent suffragists. Bifurcated clothing liberated the legs, allowing for a new range of activities like riding a bicycle. But significantly, the call for reform dress began as men and women argued that the amount of women's underclothing, the constrictive corset, often with whalebone or some other kind of stiffening agent to really kind of keep the diaphragm in, and the sheer weight of women's clothes were harmful to women's health. These health reformers sought alternatives to the constricting fashionable styles in attempts to make fashion rational, hygienic, and beautiful. Like those reformers concerned with health, the aesthetic dress movement that began in England was concerned about the excessive weight of the clothing. However, they also objected to the ornamentation of Victorian dress, favoring a simpler and cleaner line and decoration. Aesthetic or artistic dress was sparked by influential artists and designers such as those of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, a counterculture of artists and writers who viewed the rigid fashions of the day as artificial and unattractive. Painters such as Dante Gabriel Rossetti, whose painting is here on the screen, depicted women in clothing inspired by classical, medieval, and Renaissance styles. Rejecting The restrictive tailored clothing of the Victorian era, aesthetes and practitioners of artistic and reform dress embraced, again, this less ornamented, softer, and more comfortable clothing inspired by these historic examples. Loose, uncorseted styles were reminiscent of those worn in ancient Greece. Again, there's this element of antiquity really infusing what defined Bohemian dress at this moment. And again, as I said, medieval Europe. With surface design often influenced by the Far East. The most popular forms of artistic dress reflected a high-waist empire style, which became the dominant silhouette between 1909 and 1915. Although it had emerged earlier in the form of a tea gown. The tea gown, or looser house gown as it was initially worn only in the home while entertaining close friends. A fashionable garment during the 1880s and 1890s, the tea gown was viewed by many as a rational garment. This idea of rationalism and truth to materials was really formative for the thinkers around fashion at this time, the radical thinkers, that is, around fashion at this time. And women would wear these without a corset, which is one of the reasons why it was deemed appropriate only for the home and not outside the home. Until very soon, there were some rule breakers. But the one example we have on the screen here, this is from the collection of the V&A. And in 1884, the British department store Liberty's had opened a dress department under the guidance of designer E.W. Godwin. He was a member of the aesthetic movement, which favored, again, artistic dress for women based on these classical ideals. The gown is close to Walter Crane, another arts and crafts designer. His designs for aesthetic dress that he printed in Algea, the Journal of Healthy and Artistic Dress, the Journal of the Healthy and Artistic Dress Union. So there was a complete formation, a kind of a institutionalization of these ideas that came together to kind of put forward the ideals around dress reform. The greenery Valerie colors are the feature of aesthetic dress, and the epaulettes and high-waisted dark green velvet overdress are historical references to the Renaissance period. But reformers in the US were influenced by the aesthetic movement across the Atlantic and Britain, of which, again, we have the example on the screen, and advocates for reform dress in the US, like Annie Jenness Miller, who through her publication Dress, the Jenness Miller magazine, stressed, quote, adaptation of art principles to life and to dress. Similar to arts and craft tenets of truth to nature and utility, Jenness Miller stressed the, quote, divine beauty and purity of the natural human figure, end quote, and argued that the true ideal beauty could be achieved by returning the body to its natural form. To provide one other example, further afield than Britain, reform dress in Vienna is one that we can certainly, there's reform dress in Germany, there's reform dress in Japan. So I'm just providing just a few touchstones here, but one that I find to be quite evocative. On the screen are images of Emily Flöge, the Viennese secession painter Gustav Klimt's lover. You see a painting of Flöge here on the far side of the screen, but you may know him better from the kind of a famous painting called The Kiss, which is covered in it's covered in gold, and it's there's been movies about it, in fact. But Flöge was his lover and very much his equal. And she was a progressively minded woman who in 1904 opened the Salon Schwestern Flöge with her sisters Helene and Pauline. They created sizable collections of fashion accessories and fabrics together with innovations in the reform dress aesthetic, designed again to liberate women's bodies from conventional dress restrictions like the corset. But caftans like what we saw on Flöge there a moment ago, were not just for women. Many masculine presenting and masculine artists took on the kaftan in the late 19th and early 20th century. Just two examples on the screen, architect Bernard Maybeck, who designed the temple I mentioned just a few minutes ago, and of course, Gustav Klimt, also here in a loose, kind of freely flowing kaftan that allowed full movement of the body. But if we return to the United States, in the years just before the outbreak of the First World War, and we're going to shift to New York here for a second because it's really a center, an important center when it comes to reform dress and Bohemianism in the early 20th century. And these principles adhere to the avant-garde feminist conception of the new woman that occupied the intelligentsia and the hotbeds of the American left, like I said, and Greenwich Village in particular. Women in these circles, like San Francisco native and journalist Louise Bryant, in the center on the screen, writer and art collector Mabel Dodge Luhan, who eventually moved to Taos and had a formidable art colony there, and playwright, actress, and fellow suffragist Ida Rao, eschewed the sinuous S-shaped silhouette formed by the tautly laced foundation garments for the artistic dress of couturier Paul Poiret, or more commonly, the sack-like tunics, batik kaftans, and embroidered smocks fashioned by local artisans. And here we just have two images taken by one of the first early female photojournalists, Jessie Tarbox Beals, who took photographs around Greenwich Village. And then also one of the little progressive avant-garde magazines, The Quill, which shows this similarly across all these images. You should see the kind of frocks, smocks, kaftan-like shapes, as well as the impulse to look to parts of Asia for the decorative motifs, as the illustration in the center shows. This new mode permeated avant-garde circles at the beginning of the decade, and by 1914 came to define a more progressive feminist style that was constructed in opposition to both the conservative shirtwaists and even more forward Poiret-inspired tunic dresses and hobble skirts. Initially sold only in small independent shops, artistic dress was quickly taken up by mainstream fashion and made available in larger midtown stores. Scholar Deborah Saville defines artistic dress as garments of long robes of silk and sandals, often including what she called peasant embroideries, but really I think it's important to say non-Euro-American or non-Western embroideries. And I explored this subject more significantly in an exhibition I did in 2013 called An American Style: Global Sources for New York Textile and Fashion Design. And in this exhibition, it was really an exploration of a project where MDC Crawford, who was a kind of evangelist of an evangelist of an American aesthetic, really trying to set something apart from what was coming in France. So at this moment, right around World War I, all of the design direction was coming from Paris, really, and Europe more broadly. So it was a moment where kind of New York in its kind of upstart fashion sought to try to create something different, create something that was wholly American, and I use that in quotes, wholly American, because again, there was nothing coming from Europe because of the start of the war, but it was also very much steeped in this kind of jingoistic, patriotic language around a national style, a national identity, as the United States was kind of coming up in the early 20th century. And what's so interesting about this is that the motifs or the ideas were not American as in Euro-American, or even the emigre European designers who were often working in this project, but rather taken from the ethnographic collections of the American Museum of Natural History. So here, for example, you see designer Alaka Karatz wearing a Peruvian mantle, an Andean mantle, on the cover. Here's just one example of a tea gown, a really incredible batik tea gown that was created in the collection of the Brooklyn Museum collection that is now at the Costume Institute in New York, where the batik is a wax resist process. I don't know if any of you know that, but it's a wax resist process that has been used in South Asia for centuries even. And in doing this and thinking about the silhouette in particular and thinking about the liberation of the body, in this project, there were a number of designers, Ruth Reeves being one of them, who went into the storerooms of the ethnographic collections at the American Museum of Natural History and literally put on the objects to try to see how these indigenous garments fit and how they, in fact, allowed a certain kind of freedom of the body to kind of, and these photographs were ostensibly taken to inspire other designers on how to kind of push their own designs and create this new purportedly American design aesthetic. And this all culminated in an exhibition that was in 1919, again, at the American Museum of Natural History, where a number of these designs by the local designers were put on display, some of which were done under the auspices of different department stores, for example, A. Beller & Co. or Bonwit Teller. But while this was very much steeped in this idea of the new woman, this liberated woman who often had a job, she was not part of a kind of heteronormative family structure. As I said, she was often an artist or a performer, really trying to push the boundaries of what was acceptable in 1914, 1915, 1916, which is hard for us to imagine now because we often, not everyone certainly has the same liberties as, even though they should, but often there's a lot more kind of choice for everyone as far as how they want to live their life compared to the situation that women were kind of coming up in at the late 19th century. So really reform dress was pushing against these conventional norms and pushing against the kind of political ideals of the patriarchal society that was in existence and remains in existence today to some extent. But I want to turn now to an example of a couture garment, right? So not one of these kind of homespun, so to speak, or individual garments made in the studios of Greenwich Village, but rather something that has really kind of taken on this bohemian ideal and has continued to represent it across the 20th century. So we haven't quite left Greenwich Village yet. In the breeding grounds for this anarchistic individualism in Greenwich Village and also in San Francisco, the inimitable columnar gowns by Venice, Italy-based Spanish artist and designer Mariano Fortuny y Madrazo and his partner and lover Henrietta Negrin were de rigueur for anyone who could procure one. Derived from the precisely draped Ionic chiton of Greek antiquity, the Delphos and later the two-piece peplos dresses, according to Fortuny, were designed in such a shape and with such mechanisms, namely a combination of drawstring cording and striated Murano glass beads, as to permit easy use and comfortable adjustment, making them an unsurprising favorite of dance reformers Ruth St. Denis, Isadora Duncan, as well as the itinerant new women who often traveled back and forth between the coasts. The interest in Fortuny's designs is evidenced in several sources, including the memoir of Joseph Freeman, an editor of the Masses, which is another one of these avant-garde little magazines like The Quill, that described, quote, the uniform of the new freedom, bobbed hair, cigarettes, sandals, batik blouses, and Fortuny gowns, end quote. And he wrote this in 1938. Oh, just to go back. And so purportedly the design, again, here you see how it's constructed along the sleeve. And this is one of the patent drawings from the actual design itself, but is based on the charioteer of Delphi, which was unearthed at the end of the 19th century. So it was part of this piece of antiquity that literally came out of the ground and was, of course, all over all the various forms of publication at the time, and really inspired Fortuny and even more so Henrietta Negrin, his partner and lover, to design what has become such an iconic dress over the 20th century. So here we have two images of Isadora Duncan, who was a pioneer of modern dance and a very, very big fan of Fortuny. She's not wearing Fortuny in these images, but there are images of some of her dancers in Fortuny, and she's kind of often commented on it, even though I wasn't able to locate some for today. But I think you can see as she's kind of representing the extreme movement that she wants to have with her body, and why the Fortuny dress, with its accordion-like pleating and malleability of shape, really allows for that to happen. Fortuny created clothing that has a fluid relationship with the body, responsive to its form, but also revealing its shape in the manner of intimate garments. Actresses and dancers, including San Francisco's own Isadora Duncan, who was a close friend of Boyton, Boyton of the Temple of the Wings that we saw a few minutes ago. St. Denis and Eleanor Duse were among the first to wear his designs in public, right? So what was so interesting about these gowns is similar to the tea gowns. They were initially designed for indoor use only. These were women who felt free to deviate from the strict conventions of dress, such as rigid underpinnings that both reshaped and concealed the figure. Produced in a host of colors, Since 1907, Fortuni's sensual gowns adhered to the natural and decidedly corset-free curves of the body, an effect of the designer's patented plissé pleating technique, and pulled dramatically at the wearer's ankles. As it was originally conceived as a tea gown, the Delphos was typically unlined, a detail that compelled more modest wearers to cover the dress's almost sheer silk lengths with printed velvet cloaks and gauze-like tunics stenciled with Venetian motifs and decoration borrowed from North Africa and Asian cultural traditions. These revivalist garments fused the elite tastes of haute couture's made-to-measure handicraft with the bohemian embrace of the occult, Greek classicism, and so-called Orientalist fantasies that were explored in, for example, San Francisco-based Adelaide Hanscom's photogravures, one of which was shown earlier, of cloaked mystics and veiled nudes, or photographer Anne Brigman's pagan-inflected compositions of robed and sometimes nude models alongside the weathered cedars and pines of the Sierra Nevada. By the 1920s, the increased demand for Fortuni's densely corrugated dresses paralleled a critical shift in the counterculture milieu. Rather than subscribing to a life of poverty, which George Sterling had once famously touted as a bohemian virtue, if you recall, members of this early 20th century movement developed a more opulent framework for their anti-conformist ethos. In the Bay Area in particular, Bohemianism and bourgeoisie was spored by the elite classicism of the art and cultural displays at San Francisco's 1915 Panama Pacific International Exhibition on one hand, and the cathartic effects of World War I in 1918 on the other. Likewise, the broader stateside enthusiasm for the invariably classical aesthetics of Fortuni's garments increased. In a 1923 editorial, Vogue announced the opening of a New York storefront that would import Fortuni's most sought-after wares. And in doing so, emphasized the old world cachet imbued in his textiles and fashions by characterizing his designs as never new, concluding that, quote, Fortuny doesn't make new things. Anyone could do that. And the Vogue for Fortuny has never really gone out of style since. Here on the screen, we have Tina Chow, a model, jewelry designer, and collector of Fortuny, who embodied the bohemian spirit in the 1980s. And more recently, in 2016, Valentino paid homage to the historic designs of Fortuny. And you can see examples of both on the screen. Fashion scholar Elizabeth Wilson, who I quoted earlier, has argued that, quote, Bohemia is more than a series of stories about individuals. The figure of the bohemian, she continues, personifies a cultural myth about modernity, end quote, a myth that seeks to reconcile those who inhabit the margins of society. Again, we're talking about the fringe. And in the early 20th century, as I've shown, nowhere was more at the fringe than the artists and writers of the Bay Area. To summarize, the gilded decadence of interwar bohemianism, evidenced by those that wore Fortuny into their literary salons in Greenwich Village and here in the Bay Area, stands in stark contrast to the more politically motivated counterculture that came before it in the 1910s and persisted well after it into the 1980s. While approaches to leftist art and politics in these periods ranged from provincial actions to large-scale demonstrations, shared across this constellation of divergent cultural scenes was the sartorial desire to dress a la mode, to be up to date. However, being fashionable in these contexts was not about donning what you would call clothes, as one bohemian character in Susan Glaspell's 1922 play Chains of Drew explains, but rather about wearing ideas. I've tried to present here a set of examples, if not provocations, for discussion. Bohemianism in the late 19th and early 20th century is far more nuanced and also widespread than what I have shown here. But across the various permutations, it is a countercultural ethos and a sense of liberation that, as Savoir-Faire, commentator about Chloé, said, is encapsulated as flou. Thank you. Oh, and I will just ask, what does boho mean to you, with two images of our beloved Chloé collections on the screen? Thank you. Yeah.
So, sorry, excuse me. Bohemianism today has been largely influenced by festival culture. Do you think the Coachellafication of Bohemianism has influenced how we view the subcultures Bohemianism is derived from? And what is one Bohemian trend today that you would attribute to festival culture and its influence?
Wow, great question. Thank you. So repeat the first part. Just repeat the first part of the question.
Oh,
So no, it's all right. I can hear you.
Bohemianism has been largely influenced by festival culture. Do you think that Coachellafication of Bohemianism has influenced how you view the subcultures Bohemianism is derived?
That's a great question. In my opinion, because I think there's probably a lot of opinions about that. I do think that Coachella has really, you know, I don't want to like take down Coachella here because I think I personally haven't been, but I'm sure it's fun for some people. But I do think that the fashion of Coachella, particularly, you know, in its earlier iterations, 2003 and after, was really pernicious towards the subcultures that it was appropriating. You know, I showed the image of the feather headdress, right? The way in which that cultural appropriation was rampant at Coachella. And really in ways that were harmful to the indigenous cultures in which they were citing, right? The feather headdresses are, and that happened in the early 20th century, the project about the American Museum of Natural History that I mentioned, where feather headdresses were seen as kind of largely Native American, right? But they're a very specific tribal representation of a very specific culture. And so the way in which that those appropriations travel and kind of significantly shape the way the broader public who might not know the difference thinks about it is really dangerous. And I think that happened with Coachella as well. And that I think that Coachella, you know, rightly so, got a bad rap for it. And I think anyone who feels that they want to, you know, wear these kind of gauzy, flowy things, I think there are moments when that is seen as then Coachellafied, right? Rather than a desire just to wear a loose garment where you can move your body freely, which is completely a choice that everyone has, right? And so unfortunately, there's certain markers of that and the type of products that get designed and sold that automatically kind of connect it back to Coachella, and that's really dangerous. So I don't know how we break free of Coachella's shaping of the kind of recent cultural history around fashion, but I look forward to ideas from any of you. But I saw a hand raised in the back.
Yeah, people in general should be wearing religious imagery. It doesn't. People in general should be wearing religious imagery. So great, it's so out there. It should be respected because once it's adopted by fashion, lose all its meaning. That imagery, the jobs, feather headdresses.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point just for the those who are virtually with us. The comment was that any sort of religious imagery should be respected and not kind of worn freely. I think it's what gets dangerous about that is who polices those decisions. Right. So yes, I absolutely agree that I don't think anyone should be walking, or personally, I don't think anyone should be walking around in a feather headdress right now, unless it's part of their cultural representation and they're kind of that's a choice that they can make. However, I do think that when it comes down to who gets to make those decisions of what's appropriate and what's not is when things can get really dangerous. Yeah.
There's an interesting topic
Mhm.
about the role of all
Mhm.
in developing exoticism
Mhm.
versus whether that's bohemianism or whether it's largely.
Yeah.
I thought I might want. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I mean, when we were doing our research, we learned about parades. And then I really not feel like that there is a big difference. And do you feel like
I guess like what are the main differences and like
Mhm.
how do they differ from France and the United States? If there is an answer to that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And Paul Poiret is so huge, as you know, so hugely influential, really kind of seen as, well, I think the nickname given to him, at least by the Met's exhibition, if not before, was the King of Couture, which, I think that Paul Poiret's appropriation of North African and South Asian motifs is certainly falls into this language of cultural appropriation and exoticism, right? Which is kind of taking these motifs freely and then marketing them not only as his own, but as something that really conveys in his vision, like a mystical kind of spiritual experience without being anchored in the actual kind of cultural object that he was taking from, right? So I do think that's dangerous. And I think, it's hard to take down Poiret. He was so kind of impactful and a very talented couturier. But he was very he was kind of peripatetic, he kind of like traveled around and took what he wanted. And then he had, his daughter making drawings and he had young girls kind of creating these designs, mostly textiles that he felt like showed kind of innate creativity, right? So he was sampling what he could for the sake of this kind of vision of something that is countercultural, but also not unlike Fortuny, also extremely expensive, right? So it was countercultural, but it wasn't bohemian in its sense of being about, as the definitions that we looked at, like being about, kind of an idealistic vision where one might be poor, one might not have any money, but is living kind of a truth, kind of a seemingly, right, as a purportedly authentic vision of what life should be and dressing to match. So I think there's a distinction between what's happening in a couture house. I think Fortuny kind of bridges that gap in a weird way, and also really what I'm interested in thinking about is here specifically in the Bay Area, especially, is the way in which the kind of Greco-Roman and kind of pagan antiquities really informed a kind of bohemian ideal, but it's couched within what is like a mostly white, relatively affluent, even if they were somewhat also living without very much money, depending on what their circumstances were, constituency here at the turn of the 20th century. Yeah.
The notion that the borrowing of the construction of the garment that you can't copyrighted, but the textile is copyrighted. Is that like the notion that they can appropriate it from the silhouette that you find, like they can't appropriate the.
It's very hard. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. It's very hard, as far as I understand, and I'm not a copyright expert, but in copyright laws, in the scope of time that we're talking about from 1850 now is still relatively new. But it's very hard to prove even a silhouette, I believe, like prove any sort of copying within fashion in the United States. Yes, exactly. Thank you. The lawsuit example I provided was Urban Outfitters, when the Navajo people successfully were able to sue them for using the kind of the symbols, the spiritual symbols, and putting it on things like underwear and flasks, right? Which, and I'm, it's not fair or appropriate use of what are really important spiritual cultural symbols, and really about a cultural identity, wherein someone like Paul Poiret or Urban Outfitters is just kind of taking as they choose and then applying it to objects for sale. It's completely devoid of its kind of spiritual and cultural context, and it's dangerous. And so I think in terms of the copywriting of the silhouette versus the garment, I mean, what I was talking about with Klimt was more that he also embodied this kind of bohemian ideal, even though he was wealthy because he was already selling his artworks with the Vienna Secession, by wearing kind of these loose, free flowing garments himself that were designed by Floga, as well as the ones that she designed for herself and for sale. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
So we have a question about the relationship between bohemianism
because we're in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
here, San Francisco, the digital capital of nowhere,
Mhm.
and how that relates to.
Oh, okay. I will try my best to answer that. No, it's a great question. That's really interesting. I mean, what immediately comes to mind, right, is all like, this is 15, 20 years ago now, is, you know, all the talk about like the coders in their sweatshirts, right? And the way in which the early, I think less so now in this particular moment we're in right now, but 10, 15 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago, and I'm dating myself here, where like, you know, the early years of Facebook, it was about, you know, wearing jeans and a sweatshirt and staying up all night. And it was its own kind of counterculture, right? And it saw itself, right? I'm sure, I would think that, you know, Zuckerberg would probably confirm this, like they saw themselves as doing something that was in reaction to the dominant culture, which is really the kind of fundamental operation of Bohemianism as I see it, right? And it takes its own kind of expressions in fashion, as I've shown in different valences here, in this kind of rough survey. But it's interesting to think about how in the early 2000s, 2010s, how like the tech industry kind of becomes its own bohemian, as a bohemian ideal in that moment. I mean, I would assume or suspect that there's a kind of techno bohemian ideal that's more contemporary that I'm honestly like not versed on, because I'm stuck in the 19th century. Yeah.
I think maybe I'm struck by how you're thinking about that could relate to the idea of this digital utopia
Mhm.
that tends to be kind of part of the whole idealization of technology, and maybe that relates it to bohemianism.
Yeah, I do think the striving, the way in which a utopia is kind of formed in any of these various kind of communities we're talking about is really essential to a countercultural ideal, right? And so, and that's in the 1970s, there's the Whole Earth Catalog and Stewart Brand, and which was also about a very early technological ideal, right? And that's the seeds of what we're seeing. And that was in the Bay Area here, right? And that's the seeds of what we're seeing now. And it had its own kind of countercultural flavor to it.
Generally, that press reform,
Mhm.
relationship, AIDS. Oh, okay, we'll just ask you.
And my question is, what are the difference between the 5 types of bohemianism? Novel, gypsy, beat, zen, and then
So Nouveau, Gypsy, Beat, and what were the last two?
zen, then
Zen and Dandy.
Yeah.
The difference between all of those? That's a lot. That's another lecture. That's great. I'll take Dandy, because we had an image of, and we can go back to it. We had an image of Oscar Wilde, but it was a caricature. It was a satirical drawing. There he is. And he is the kind of iconic dandy of the 19th century, playwright and poet. And he was also associated with the aesthetic movement, which I talked about kind of briefly in the presentation, which the symbol of which is the sunflower that you see kind of surrounding Wilde in this caricature. And so the dandy as a bohemian kind of countercultural ideal is one where it's often typically a male presenting person who is kind of taking on more feminine characteristics and kind of pushing against the dominant definitions and associations with masculinity. So in the late 19th century, it came up as he often wore a purple suit, which was often he was derided. There's various names that he was called that somehow took on this color in a derogatory way. Sorry, I can't conjure them right now, but I know they existed. So I would say that, dandy's a really interesting idea of Bohemianism, even if it's not kind of what I talked about here. It is one and wherein it wasn't, the body was still constricted, like the suits that men were wearing were still quite rigid. In fact, dandies sometimes even wore tighter suits than what was of the norm at the time. But they wore shorter pants. Sometimes in the very early period, they wore calf enhancers, which were these kind of padded socks that literally made your calf look athletic. It was initially fashionable in the 18th century in the royal courts in France. But a lot of the late 19th century dandies kind of picked up that idea for a voluptuous calf being kind of a signifier of one's prowess, if you will.
Is it also significant for the lifestyle?
For a lifestyle? Yeah, it was supposed to, we're supposed to look athletic, but not having had to do the actual work of getting a shapely calf. That was the idea of the calf enhancers. But you know, I think gypsy as a group is one that also has a very complicated history given its cultural and ethnic associations, which I don't think we have time to, it's a really big subject that we don't really have time to get into, but it is one that, especially within kind of festival culture, that has been appropriated in more recent years and taken up. I think that's a really good question.
Yeah, I think, just to amplify on this, I feel like it's one of the things that makes it bohemian is the using dress as a form of self-expression and a way to present the self. And dandies, from what I've read, were about basically obscuring their class, the lack of aristocratic class, by wearing this uniform, the suit, which obscured people's identity then, so they could be who they wanted to be.
Right.
And it's in a way kind of associated with bohemianism, would you say?
Definitely. I think one thing that, you know, I didn't address as much as I would have liked to in the presentation is this idea around self-fashioning and the way that self-presentation and self-fashioning really informs all the various 5 types or otherwise versions of bohemianism. And it's self-presentation, which is why, you know, to talk about the Coachellafication, like so much about what the choices that I believe, again, I've never been, so I'm not trying to criticize something I've never been to, but I believe those that kind of took on a lot of the kind of cultural signifiers and other forms of appropriation dress, there's some appreciation in there. There's appreciation and appropriation at the same time, but that it was about self-fashioning. It was about how you want to present yourself that feels kind of contrary again to this kind of popular dominant ideal. Unfortunately, it came with these really kind of dangerous choices in terms of cultural appropriation.
So here's another subject that has come up because of where we live and just generally the relationship between self-presentation, pop culture, and Bay Area sports. And how that may or may not relate to.
Yeah. So I know that, so we can see like people now wear sportswear at any, I mean, at any occasions. So, could sportswear a kind of, modernized boho fashion style? Like, so it's not formal.
That's interesting. I haven't thought about it in that context. I would, thinking about this for the first time right now, it's such a great question. I would say my opinion is not, I wouldn't call a sportswear as being, you know, it could be part of a bohemian kind of a set of codes that someone takes on, but I think unto itself, because it is part of the dominant culture. It is part of what is, you know, because it's now it is being worn everywhere and it is dominant. And I think, you know, sportswear, I think sportswear design is in terms of fashion and athleisure is getting like, is really, the envelope is getting pushed and it's super interesting, but I'm not, for me, I wouldn't put it in a category of bohemianism because I think it is still participating in a dominant field of fashion. But I think it's a really provocative question and I appreciate it. Thank you.
We have a question from one of our Zoom attendants. Mark is asking, how has the popularity of local style influenced the economies of local communities that produce traditional handicrafts used in local fashion?
Yeah. That is also a great question that I don't have, I don't have the market analysis on that. It's not where my work has taken me. But I would guess, and I, want to couch this and saying it's a guess. I would guess that it's probably both has probably had a positive influence, right? And also a negative one, right? Positive being that potentially these communities, there's an influx of interest and of course a kind of ballooning of an economy around whatever the skill might be, and whoever the makers are in the particular communities you might be thinking of. But at the same time, when that happens, there could be some negative impacts around certain traditions getting lost in favor of doing something quicker, cheaper, for a mass market. And again, this is completely speculative on my part, having not done the market research, but that would be my inclination.
I wanted to comment on this because I from a media journalistic point of view, I have a feeling that there is definitely an overall movement and a value in the fashion world to whenever those influences are reproduced in collections. There is definitely a very strong trend of evolving those artisans in producing those garments. One of the examples, very recent one, Ralph Lauren, collaboration with Vivian Navajo, textile artist, Naomi Glasses, rethinking, visiting the traditional polo shirt. And there are many examples of that sort where, again, it's also wishful thinking. We will all wish that the brands would do this more frequently and truly delegate producing those garments to those communities,
right,
whose styles have been appropriated. And that leads to my other question. Particularly in France in the 19th century, how strongly the Bohemian movement was related to colonialism and the fascination for exotic products altogether. That's showing the possession of those garments and donning those outfits as a sign of kind of open spirits and traveling kind of lifestyle. That was part of it, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think one reason why I didn't touch France is because there's so many iterations of that happen in a very short period of time in the late 19th century into the up until World War I and certainly after. But you have Japanismo, where all of a sudden, because the borders have opened, there's all these imports coming from Japan and being collected, mostly again by a wealthy white middle and upper class, being collected, and that includes textiles and dress. And then there's a there's a mode in which the textiles start to be fabricated to mimic what's coming in from Japan, right? And then those who are wealthy are having their dresses made with this is actually like the late 18th century, but like a large box pleat in the back, so you can see the full weave of the pattern, right? But to show, so it's conspicuous consumption. It's a way to show your wealth. But those kinds of modes in which there's a perception of the exotic that's coming in, and that is exactly about colonialism, right? With the kind of French power kind of moving about the world and kind of bringing things back to the country itself for those to appreciate it. But it's complicated.
On the economic side of things, how frequently are you solicited by the brands who want to do this, right, from the history of fashion perception? Do they at all contact you as a consultant on those topics?
I've had some impromptu conversations, but I've never been hired as a consultant. But it's a very interesting question. And, I think that there's, as I was saying just moments ago, there's kind of positive examples and then there's negative ones, right? So I remember having a conversation some years ago with an Indigenous American art historian who actually studies the Baroque period, but she's Ojibwa, and I was talking. She was like, I was kind of talking about appropriation from a pretty negative point of view. And she said, yes, that's right. But you have to understand how exciting it was to go into Target and be like, that's mine. Like, I identify with that, you know? And so I think, like, you know, she also acknowledged that, like, that, you know, these things, it's not okay. But at the same time, self-representation matters so much. And when you can see that elsewhere, right? It's powerful. So
ways to do this. Right.
yeah, exactly. And so, but I was, you know, I learned a lot from that conversation, because I thought that you know, and full disclosure to everyone out there, on the internet, like I was like, oh, you know, it's bad. Like, right. This is really dangerous. And it is, like, appropriation is dangerous, and it is, exploitative, especially, right, of the indigenous communities in which things are being kind of taken without permission. But there are moments where, like the Ralph Lauren, when it's done, you know, kind of, it's giving back to the community, and it's done, you know, in full kind of awareness of all the thorny issues that surround this. Yeah.
We think, I think Bohemianism, one of the things is, well, we all want to wear colors and textiles and places we travel to with all due respect and fascination. What is the appropriate way of doing this is bringing it from those places and where it was produced, say, in African and Asian countries, this exoticism, but when it truly comes from that place and from the experiences is the sort of natural way of doing this. Like fast fashion brands appropriating that and producing the cheap knockoff copies, without the communities being involved and people being paid livable wages for that. Something we all would like to steer away from.
Absolutely. You know, it's interesting. I mean, I mentioned only briefly this 2016 project I worked on. Where are you? Here we go. And what was so fascinating about this period, again, it's in response to World War I. There's this really kind of, there's a sense of a desire for a national identity, but it's the exact worst version of what we're talking about, right? It's wherein the designers and the museum were in collaboration to create a new American design aesthetic based on things that weren't even, like, made on the continent. You know, they were taking things from South Asia, they were taking things from Africa. Like, there's everything could be consumed under the guise of an American design ideal, right? And so that, to me, is such a fascinating and frustrating project, you know, unto itself, but is kind of a benchmark for, you know, how since this is, again, 1916, so quite a long time ago, but since there are efforts to do it right. And but then there are a lot of fast fashion companies that still aren't interested in doing it right and working in collaboration. So
just to
why that is.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. It was functional. They were looking for, it was market driven. They needed new designs, right, for consumers in New York, and they were working with department stores that were producing, at this time, were producing their own works. There was some things being made in factories, but there was a lot produced inside the ateliers of the department stores. And so they were looking for something that you didn't have to import, because there was World War I was happening. And so they were closed off, and they didn't, previous to that, all of the design direction was coming from Europe. So they really felt a need. So it was functional. They were trying to fill a gap, but they did it in a way that felt, that obviously it was particularly uncomfortable, I think, for all of us.
Verifying things, but it didn't the general public thought this is the person that created this.
Right. Well, and unfortunately, the kind of political and cultural positioning of those involved in this project was what was a very, which is a now incredibly out of date perspective, which is that Indigenous people, they're no longer here, right? It's a storehouse. The museum is a storehouse of objects from that was made a long time ago, which is not true, right? Obviously, like, all of these communities are still living around us, but the perspectives at the time was that they didn't need to ask. they owned it. It was ours, and they don't know who made it because the ethnographers that in the 19th century went to the communities in the Midwest just took things, right? They took objects and brought them back to the museum. They don't know who made it, and they're not particularly interested in knowing who made it. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's been happening a long time before that, but it was still happening into the early 20th century, and much later than I think anyone would really like to admit in the 20th century.
Well, there's a reckoning point. See,
Of course, yeah.
that's a- But they're relooking their collections as to how much and what was acquired, how it was acquired. Who actually owned
Mhm.
cultural artifacts. All of those things are being looked at.
Yeah, but they don't, if they took it in, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's the person who made it and designed it, but there are no records. Because often these ethnographers in 1870, went to a Native American community in Nebraska and just took it and didn't write down who made it. So we might know the community or the tribe, right? And there's conversations that are happening now about how to repatriate these objects, but up until now, because there's no information and because there wasn't very much interest in doing so for a long time, unfortunately, these objects were kind of just there for study in the case of a lot of these designers, and in the case of, in 1916, the museum curators for inspiration.
I think there's a very fine line between culture appropriation and cultural representation.
Mhm.
And a lot of people in the process of representing a culture cross that line and goes into appropriation. And I feel like if they want to really represent a culture, and Bohemianism is all about self-expression.
Mhm.
And if you really feel for that particular culture, I think the best way to do it is by supporting designers from that particular culture.
Mhm.
And even like urban outfitters, instead of just naming a
Right.
collection based on a tribe, they could have chosen a designer who belongs to that particular and then collaborated with them and created a design. I think that makes a huge difference between the representation and appropriation part. And I feel that a lot of people, because are getting more knowledge about the difference and are trying to make it better, because it is the Coachella season right now, and I've seen a lot of videos who want to wear something that represents their culture, and the way they are doing is not exactly wearing the clothes that are worn in that particular culture, but wearing the designers that's appropriate for that particular
Right.
culture. So they're trying to find a way, but I think there's a very fine line.
I agree. And I think it's really exciting that we are now in a place where there are collaborations, respectable collaborations happening. And culture is not stagnant. It's not frozen in time, right? So what these curators and designers saw as culture in 1916 is not what we see today. And it's, communities, a really kind of dangerous line of thinking that was happening in the 19 teens was that like these communities were no longer with us. We have their objects, but they're not here. But obviously that's not true, right? Like the indigenous American tribes that have been on this continent for centuries are still here, right? And their communities are developing and growing, and there's no one version, right, that we can kind of set in time at 1916 that's also today, right? These things, we're all growing and changing, right? And so I think that it's really exciting to see collaborations that are respectful, and ones that really try to give back to the community, and ways in which we all can choose to represent our own communities, right? And that's where fashioning, self-presentation comes in and can be really powerful. Yeah, thank you.
I think that when you were talking about this idea of decolonizing that, it's called, where if you use the dress of indigenous people in a Western fashion collection, that it elevates the lives
economically, politically, every other way, of the people who, indigenous artifacts here appropriate. So it, you know, you use the local artisans, but I think that's just starting. I feel like this is just my personal opinion, maybe I'm jaded, but I feel like the whole Route 1 situation is damage control, like avoiding cancellation. It's like he's the king of creation. That's just my personal opinion. That might be, that's what I'm saying. That might be a way of comes back to the so yeah, it's actually laws. Yeah, right. So does anyone have any other questions about this? So one, I just wanted to make an observation and have a comment.
Okay, great.
So I didn't know, I wasn't aware, or I hadn't come to this conclusion before kind of studying a little bit more about Bohemianism for this event. But it strikes me how Bohemianism is so associated with certain class signifiers. It's also associated with the male gaze. Men seem to be extremely preoccupied with dress reform and with the female body. There are, of course, women who were leading reforms also, but it seems so largely based on Western, sort of even Eurocentric, although I know we're talking about America.
Absolutely.
Largely elitist class kind of system, because you have to have all of your basic needs met, and, you know, to be able to think about art, being an artist and being able to express yourself through identity creation seems like a preoccupation that's a privilege.
Right.
I never realized.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I mean, I kind of acknowledged in the presentation, this is a largely kind of white story. It's also one in which it is about class privilege. I mean, so many of the definitions that I shared about for Bohemianism, it says, you know, about having, you know, not having any money, not having enough money to buy alcohol, right? The 1850 definition. But in truth, like that's, and then I tried to acknowledge this earlier. I mean, that is not a luxury that most people have, right? Or a choice that most people have. And so I think it's a combination in terms of what we know, is particularly about the 19th century. It's a combination of male privilege, class privilege, racial privilege, but also because of those three things coming together, those are the stories that have been recorded, right? So one of the challenges I face, and I'm interested in facing it and solving it, is what are the other stories? So in some cases, it's easier to find out about the women associated with these particular groups of men, right? And of course, it's worth acknowledging that in the Bay Area in the 1850s and 1880s, there weren't a lot of women here. There certainly were some, and some were really incredible. And like, I mean, they were all really incredible. I think it was a pretty hard scrabble life in a lot of ways, unless you were kind of in a very affluent situation. But, you know, how do you bring those narratives forward is always like a researcher's and a historian's challenge, but it's doable. It's just, you have to kind of cut through what has been received thus far.
So I think what would be a good place to sort of encapsulate all of this would be just curious about your opinion about who or what part of our social system today do you think represents Bohemian values most clearly?
That's a great question. Again, I'm so stuck in the 19th century. You know, I think what's so interesting, the Bohemian kind of strains, at least that I've looked at thus far as part of these projects, really are, you know, about this counter-dominant narrative. And certainly there may be this techno-bohemianism that we were already talking about. But because of the world being so-called flat due to technology, right? Like, how do you get away? Like, how do you get away, or how are you, where's
the margins?
yeah, who is on the margins? And I think politically we can, you know, there's certainly a lot of margins that are worth discussing, that are happening in real time right now, of course.
Yes.
But when it comes to, you know, there's certain counterculture groups that have, you know, moved to the woods. Sure, that happened in the 1970s. It's happening now. I don't know that that's like a defining factor of bohemianism, or at least for me, for what I'm interested in exploring. I think it's an interesting one, but it's not one that is, you know, exclusively defines it. So I think that's a great question for you and for your students. If like, what is bohemian today? Artists.
But you know, and
Mhm.
many artists are very well established and you know, so very wealthy. Categories. But at the same time, this idea of liberating the body
Mhm.
from constraint and from conditions or like, societal norms in a
Mhm.
way, plus wearing your values and showing your ideas through those floating choices and the free floating forms and that fluidity. And makes us think about and like an artistic community all together.
Mhm.
But I like the different
Mhm.
idea well where they simply not think of it with sweatshirts, you know, that it define
Mhm.
that it belongs to formal wear
Yeah.
in a way, but somehow it's very similar.
Mm-hmm. And then and other societal norms. I mean, I feel like I read, and again, this is just kind of an off the cuff comment, but an article about certain subsets of the tech industry where they're like eating like food gels, like rather than meals, like it just so you can just work constantly, right? Or it's like not focusing or feeling that it was important to like, you know, sit down, take a break from working and like go have a salad or whatever, you know, and just like, what is the most efficient way to get nutrients in my body? Like, well, you know, so it becomes a lifestyle, which is so much about what I'm talking about here, that it's more than, it is about freeing the body in terms of your dress, in terms of the 19 teens, right? But it's also about this culture, these cultural and these kind of daily practices that signify as something that is counter dominant, right? So, but I don't know. I mean, I feel like I read that randomly at some point, so I could be wrong. Don't quote me.
Because one part of our event today, to celebrate the lecture with us was to try and dress, you know, that's
Mhm.
vocal roots. And again, as far as
Yeah.
there's a comment of your whatever choices. I can start because it's very shy. No, I'll, for me, the try to invite people to look, but that's how I dress every day. It's very different from how I am, but often it is embroidery, like some ethnic elements, and definitely some kind of dangling
Mhm.
anything, and like visibly like voluminous accessories.
Mhm.
Like the take on the, but for sure ethical influences that kind of mix with maybe some sports or follower, but this is a bomber, which
Mhm.
is not in traditional kind of bohemian hot with type of wear, but at the same time it's free flowing. Most importantly, it is important embroidery, so it has this kind of like ethical
Mhm.
component to it. So like, you guys are welcome to not show yourself and comment on what you would do in your idea of the full on the show. You don't have to show yourself, you can just comment on what you get from the style.
I just see it. It's like it's where
People wear underwear as power. That's absolutely true, like undress becoming dress, because it breaks down, we kind of have a breakdown of rules and formality. And appropriateness. So there's this idea to wear garments that would have only been worn next to the skin and something over it, but those are pretty appropriate. For me, I just want this, because it's a part of the set, and I want to. That's why I do not wear anything for the But yeah, so for me, this is great. That was very much giving for me, and that's why I just decided to wear this one. But the whole set is very my personal favorite. And actually, it was gifted to me by my aunt, so that's why. And also, for me, it's the whole thing. It's just a 3%. It's a real word, very cool, and crop top, and then it's so, but I can also listen to this because it's so.
Yeah, I know.
That's why I have to carry it. But for me, it's more of, as I said, it was more of a representation my culture. It's a lot of things that I have to do. And but that was more than that. I did great. I didn't think that was
Next time.
One last question from our Zoom attendees. So Marguerite Hernandez, who's costume design major, is asking what would be the solution for designers going forward while being mindful of cultural appropriation. I would say this solution for designers in using sustainable clothing and collections, but being mindful of cultural appropriation. The right way to do this, which we partially discussed.
Yeah, I mean, my feeling is always collaboration, research and collaboration, and also authenticity, right? So not only locating someone you want to work with, but learning as much as you can about if there is a particular kind of cultural production or aesthetic or community you want to work with. You know, it's important to learn as much as you can about them, but about that community, but then also collaborate, you know, I wouldn't advise designing in isolation in that way. So I think we all need to just talk to people more in general.
Sure. Yes. It will be wrapping up our event on Zoom and on YouTube. So thank you to everyone who watched this on Zoom and who will be watching us in YouTube recording. And we will see you in the fall on our next conversation series. Stay tuned. Thank you so much, Anne.
Thank you. And thank you all for your attention here and out there.
With that.
Okay, we're not on the record anymore.